The panel now is called Contested Identities in the United States. Now, the United States is one of these fascinating countries in which we have a liberal democracy. Liberal democracy basically means that we have a democratic system with the idea being that the power originates with the people. And then it's a liberal democracy in the sense that over time we've allowed more and more people over time to be included as to who gets to have this power within our liberties. What we're going to be hearing today are 4 different papers of people who are looking at how Americans have been able to hew out that spot for themselves within this, American liberal democracy. The first of the papers we're going to be hearing today is by Fiona Sackett, entitled Republican Motherhood and the Cult of Domesticity, Their Own Separate Spheres. The second paper we're going to be hearing today is by Breanne Brisky. It's entitled The Road to Hell is Paved with Good Intentions, Eugenics Advocates Within Indiana. Then we're going to hear from Hannah Smith in her paper entitled The American Dream, All for One or One for All. And then we're going to finish today with a paper by Holly Holland entitled American Dream, Inclusion by Ethnicity and Family. So first paper we're going to be hearing from, of course, is Fiona Sackett.
So I want to begin by explaining that a lot of my secondary sources don't actually give a specific definition of what is the cult of domesticity or the Republican motherhood. So it's important to imagine these more as working definitions and examples more than exact, precise, like this is what it means in the dictionary every single time. So when considering women's equality in the United States, the average person considers examples such as the suffragist movement at the turn of the 20th century or the feminist movements in the 60s and 70s. These 2 movements did not just occur on a whim, however. They were curated by previous movements and expectations held for women that they felt necessary to modernize and alter, much to the chagrin of traditionalists of their respective time periods. The same can be said about both Republican motherhood and the cult of domesticity. While slightly overlapping, the 2 movements have many nuanced differences. The first to appear, Republican motherhood, was the post-revolutionary war movement for women. Higher expectations for knowledge and education were the main goal in order to raise better American citizens. In contrast, the cult of domesticity begins to develop after Andrew Jackson is elected president. While education was still a major focal point, the real priority was morality in the community. Women were often seen in Reformation movement groups such as education or temperance. The work that is done both by the Republican motherhood movement and the cult of domesticity are large factors that have inadvertently influenced modern American feminism. To understand the Republican motherhood movement, it is important to understand some of the other general ideas that were beginning to spread during the time period. Following the American-influenced Enlightenment ideals, women's roles expanded. Instead of women just being inferior to men or a helpmate, they were envisioned as different. What this entails is an additional task that was necessary for a woman, and more specifically, a wife, in the home beyond the traditional roles of women seen in earlier time periods. Previously, a wife's goal in life was to make her husband happy, to be in any necessary way. This usually meant that dinner was ready when he came home and that the home was clean and the children were kept quiet. While traditional consideration for husband and housekeeping was still transitioned into Republican motherhood as important, it was also expected that a wife was to be more like a friend unto her husband. This meant that their individual roles as a woman and man were going to intercede more than in previous generations, and so because of that, women needed to be able to entertain their husbands. This comes specifically from the Scottish Enlightenment, the only major group to really discuss women, the education of women specifically. According to David Hume, the ability to intellectually entertain a husband was only really necessary for a woman, for a wife in a monarchical society. In contrast, women in a republic did not need to be educated because their husbands would be far too busy with political matters to need amusement. However, there's very little known about how influential the Scottish philosophers actually were. Instead, what occurred with the Republican motherhood was the exact opposite. Women were actually encouraged to become more educated because America was a republic. It was not necessary for a husband's benefit, but for her American children. A Republican mother's role was to teach her children the ideals of republicanism. In this context, republicanism is defined as self-determination, limited government, and individual rights. This education was supplemented with thorough moral and religious lessons, as well as emphasizing the importance of participating efficiently in capitalism. The first so that they would be virtuous and understand equality, the latter to be self-made men. What this means is that a woman needs to be well-versed not only in the Bible, but also political philosophers. She should not engage publicly, however, but instead shape those around her. A shining example of a Republican mother would be seen in Abigail Adams. Abigail Adams is well known for her thoughtful and intelligent conduct seen in her various letters to her husband, as well as other friends and family. She was well versed in both modern and ancient political philosophers and a strong advocate for equal education. Adams is extremely adamant about the importance of education equality, as we see in some of her other letters. That being said, even though she believed in that education equality, that did not mean she believed that women were equal to men. When she wrote John Adams at one time, she says, "Women have in general more delicate sensations than men. What touches them is for the most part true in nature." This shows that although she was a proponent for learning, she was in no way considered herself a feminist. Adams still believes that a woman's place was in the home, raising and teaching children to become upstanding members of the nation. Women were not the only advocates for education during the Republican motherhood movement, however. One of the largest proponents of the education reform for girls was actually Benjamin Rush. Rush was a man that had a busy career throughout his entire life. He signed the Declaration of Independence and also served as Surgeon General during the Revolutionary War and was a professor at the College of Philadelphia. Beyond that, he was interested in the abolition movement and the education reform. As well as the general understanding that women were the first teachers of children, Rush outlined 5 different points in a speech given at the Ladies' Academy in 1787 about the importance of women being well educated. These points were that 1, American women married earlier, and because of that, their education got shortened. 2, men needed help, and a wife should act as a steward by guiding them. 3, it was a woman's job to teach their children, since men were so frequently gone from the home. 4, the basic principle that everyone has an opportunity to influence the Republic somehow and must be trained to do so morally. And 5, that a better education would make looking over servants easier and better for women of the house. What is interesting to note is that although the intent and reflection of older principles of better wives and mothers was the standard as to why the girls were taught at Benjamin Rush's school, other times the trustees would report differently. Some would discuss the education was in order for the women to become closer to God. Also, as noted by many of the students, they were no longer content with being subordinates to husbands. This transition also reflects the changes of ideologies in the 19th century. So when the transition to the age of the common man occurred, another large influence is not just in all Americans' lives, but especially in American women's lives, was the Second Great Awakening. Gaining major traction from 1820 to about 1860, where it was peaked, there was an even larger concern for morality among the general public than in previous decades. The movement caused a larger sect of evangelicalism and revivalism. These were extremely public spectacles that occurred in religious capacities that had not been seen much previous to that. This publicity was different than the previous ideological movement of the Enlightenment. First, this movement was more accessible to all people, due to the fact that all the people at these meetings had a general understanding of what the pastor was discussing without having to know Greek or Latin. Secondly, the accessibility expanded beyond the requirement of being able to read. Church was not just a way to become more spiritual, it was also a major social factor. Oftentimes, church festivities and church on Sunday was the only time a town would be able to gather to see each other as a whole. This becomes relevant to young women, especially in these times. These wholesome activities would be the only kind of events they would be able to attend without any social pressures. Since this could be a way to potentially socialize and find suitors outside of immediate family, it would make sense for young women to become heavily involved. Women did not just disappear back into their homes to suckle half a dozen children and make sure they were good when Republican motherhood began to dwindle. Instead, they began to adapt with the times, and soon they began to follow the cult of domesticity. If Republican motherhood's focus was education with a background in religiosity, the cult of domesticity flipped those two topics around. In order to become a good mother and wife during this time, a woman needed to be able to be responsible for maintaining a household, raise children, and was also charged with a religious education for the entire family, both children and husband. It was still expected for women to remain in the private home sphere, however. There was still activeness in the community, expanding to different Reformation movements as well as religious and social exchanges. In order to begin to understand the cult of domesticity, it is important to have the understanding of the 4 different domestic virtues. The first is purity. So when a woman is pure in spirit and mind, that meaning she is not engaged in any sexual misconduct or indecency. She would be pious, which she would be able to run a moral home and make sure that her husband and children were being moral outside of the home as well. Third, she would be submissive, so that's 3 parts of submission. It's to fate, to God, and to men. In the sense, women were expected to know their place in the world was in the public sphere, where it was in the public sphere, and also respect the word of the male relative. Domesticity was the last virtue, and it had a connection to being morally clean. If your house is clean, you were clean morally. And it was spiritually uplifting. If possible, a woman should have planned parties for equally reputable people so they could show off their clean and moral house. However, there was still a focus on keeping the husband happy, as well as being socially domestic. A woman needed to be able to create a calm and relaxing place in order for her husband to come home and relax from a hard day of enduring the evils of the world. Despite the simplistic task of being the moral guardian of the entire family, while also being the ideal homemaker, there are often complications involved in the perfect mother. In this matter, it is important to consider the United States at this time not as a unified country, but instead as a conglomerate of territories that happen to share the same name. In the early 19th century, there was a growing contention between the North and the South, causing differences between their understandings in all things beyond just slavery. However, the largest difference comes from the West, specifically in modifications made by pioneer women. As people began to travel across the country to cheap and undeveloped lands, it would often be considered difficult to exist in completely separate gender spheres. While different work was given to men and women on the plains, there were often complications that made it difficult for that to be successful completely. Death, among a number of other ways, would often leave a woman with children to continue the trip alone. Take, for example, the story of Mary Ann Corbridge. After her family arrived in the United States in the 1840s with the first wave of British Latter-day Saints, her father died of cholera in 1843. Her mother's second husband left their family in 1850 with a new wife to go west to Utah Territory. The following year, at age 16, Mary Ann drove a team of oxen by herself across the plains. Her mother and 3 younger brothers followed the next year. It is important to recognize that neither of these women were ostracized. Instead, Mary Ann was known as one of the first white women to work along with the Native Americans, while her mother allowed her home to be used as a schoolhouse in a developing town. This shows that even within the same family, a strong patriarch was not always available, and so modifications were necessary and expected among Western communities. This did not mean that they considered themselves feminists. Instead, it was likely these women were so dedicated to their religion and the end goal that they were determined to arrive in Utah Territory no matter what it took. The importance of social and political movements for the women should not be understated. One large movement in this time connected to both the cult of domesticity and the tail end of Republican motherhood was the kindergarten movement. Originally from Germany, was focusing on women being able to teach young children. This movement was perfectly ideal for the cult of domesticity. Teaching was a flawless career for women. Even though it was technically in the public sphere, it still is in the women's realm to teach and to nurture and encourage children. However, with the kindergarten movement specifically, there were lots of new opportunities for women that were not previously available. From a practical sense, a kindergartner, so a kindergarten teacher, was considered to have invaluable training for motherhood. Many young women were encouraged to be trained in kindergarten and by extension obtain more education in order to gain those skills. From a more progressive look at the movement, the encouragement of young women to teach led it to be one of the first female-driven fields. It was also an opportunity to help progress reformation among lower classes. With these movements established as appropriate public outlets for women, other movements began that became much more political, which include the abolitionist movement and the suffragette movement. Although very domestic and gender separated, both the Republican motherhood movement and the cult of domesticity were able to help progress American feminism. Republican motherhood's main ideology, influenced by the American Revolution and the Enlightenment movement, was that if women got a more comprehensive education, they would be able to become better mothers and wives. This in turn would make it so although they were indulging in education themselves, it was actually a sacrificial act in that it was for the greater good of the country. With a transitional period to the period of the common man and the Second Great Awakening, women were transitioned from teachers to of influential members of the Republic to safeguards of morality for the entire family. Their considered valuableness as teachers and moral preservers made it possible to have women begin to move outside the domestic sphere into the public sphere, and though and through that, the political sphere. This gradual movement from home to political activism through Republican motherhood and the cult of domesticity has been able to influence feminist movements despite their lack of apparent progressiveness and ferocity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Next, we have Brianne Brisky, and she's going to be speaking on "The Road to Hell is Paved with Good Intentions: Eugenics Advocates in Indiana." Brianne.
So before I begin, let me first ask this question. Who in their right mind would actually support a medical procedure that would make it impossible for someone to have children? It seems like people who would support that would be awful, right?
Yeah.
Well, to begin with, let me first give you a little bit of background. What is eugenics? Well, the definition of eugenics is often contested as no one can really agree on as no one can agree about what actually makes up eugenics. So the definition I will be using to understand eugenics in Indiana is this definition by Dr. Liddell McWhirter in her book, Racism and Sexual Oppression in Anglo-America. In her book, she defined eugenics as the effort to improve the human race through selective breeding and the scientific management of sexualized populations. In other words, eugenics is trying to improve the human population. Even with this definition, however, there's issues. How do you improve the human population? Well, some people believe that in order to improve the human population, you need to advocate for the right people to reproduce. That is known as positive eugenics. Other people believe that in order to improve the human population, you need to make sure that the wrong people, in other words, criminals and those with mental deficiencies, don't reproduce. Like that prevention of reproduction is known as negative eugenics. With Indiana's first sterilization law, that was an example of negative eugenics. Indiana's first sterilization law was passed in 1907. That was the first sterilization law in the United States, and that later paved the pathway to other sterilization laws in the United States. Indiana first passed this law as there were concerns of the threats of mental deficiencies, abnormalities, and criminal tendencies. And Indiana first passed this law in order to help protect the normal population, as well as to keep the human population advancing. So, referring back to my opening statement, who in their right mind would support this? Well, surprisingly, people from professions that were supposed to help people supported this. In other words, medical doctors, school superintendents, even clergy members, they supported this sterilization law. Why? It makes no sense at face value. Well, these groups of people supported eugenics as they believed that they were generally helping the criminals, the mentally ill, and those living in poverty from reproducing. So, going back to one of the groups that supported sterilization laws, the school superintendents supported sterilization laws as they believed that it would help, as it would help students. Indiana's Asylum for the Feeble-Minded Children, this was an example of one of these schools. This is located in Jeffersonville, Indiana, and Alexander Johnson, the superintendent of this place, stated that feeble-minded children, the mentally ill citizens, were negatively impacting Indiana state resources. In other words, the resources that they're using in social work to help these people were hindering the rest of society. Oops, sorry about that. And then additionally, eugenics started gaining popularity due to the national trends in the day. During the beginning of eugenics, so from around the 1890s until the beginning of the end of it in the 1930s, the United States experienced an increasing number of people advocating for social progress and improving society. So, in other words, people were advocating for social work to help the criminals and the mentally ill, etc., in society. But as I stated earlier, Alexander Johnson, the superintendent of this asylum, he believed, he among others believed that it was actually hindering the rest of society. Various people supported eugenics. The person on the left, Henry Sharp, also known as Harry Sharp, he advocated for eugenics even before the 1907 sterilization law. He advocated for sterilization because he believed that it was safe, painless, and it did not impede on a person's everyday life. For example, he stated that when he was describing a male vasectomy, he was explaining how the patient did not even need to have any anesthesiacs, and that the next day they could go back to work. Yeah. I mean, and even in female sterilization, he argued that yes, it's slightly riskier because you have to go through this, you have to make an incision in the abdomen, and that required anesthesia. But even then, it was still safe because, well, as long as you had a skilled surgeon, it was all good. So, in other words, before the law even came to be or was even proposed, he was already advocating for a law that would allow sterilization to be performed only by legally approved surgeons. By having this law, it would help society. It would help the people in society who needed it, is what he believed. So here comes to the main bulk of my presentation, the 1907 Indiana Sterilization Law. This law was originally proposed in 1905, but it wasn't until 2 years later, on March 9th, 1907, when the law passed, and a month later it was signed into effect. In this law, it outlined the procedure on who would receive sterilization. In the original law, it was described as an act entitled to prevent procreation of confirmed criminals, idiots, imbeciles, and rapists, providing that superintendents and boards of managers of institutions where each persons are confined shall have the authority and are empowered to appoint a committee of experts consisting of 2 physicians to examine into the mental condition of such inmates. So, right in the very beginning, it states that it wanted to prevent criminals, the mentally ill, among other people, from reproducing. This implies that at first it seems like this is still cruel to impose on anyone. Like, how could medical doctors, clergy members, even people working in a school system, how could they even approve of this? Again, you have to look at their motivations. And like the actual law. In the actual law, it stated that board of medical doctors would examine the inmate. These medical personnel would examine the patient to see if they could be deemed feeble-minded and if any future offspring could be. Only after a unanimous vote where it was determined that yes, they would be feeble-minded, and any children they had would be feeble-minded as well. Only then could they vote on if sterilization was the right choice. And even then, sterilization was viewed only as the inevitable option, such that if there was no other option to be had, only then would they proceed with it. But even after that, they often asked patients and inmates to see if they consented to the procedure. And most of the time, in 1 year, 217 people out of 223 consented to being sterilized. And if consent wasn't given by the patient, then the sterilization of that patient would be on temporary hold. So, who was affected by the laws? As stated in the original law, criminals were affected by the laws. Like, criminals were one of the targeted populations because at the time, it was believed that being a criminal was due to your heredity. So at an international conference on criminal anthropology, Cesare Lombroso declared that criminals were biologically predisposed to be degenerates and unable to navigate through life. If criminals reproduced, then their criminal traits would be passed down to their offspring according to this ideology. So in other words, let's say you're a criminal, you stole a cow, you go to jail, you later get married, you have children. It was thought of at that time that your children will also be criminals, steal cows, and then this cycle would continue and continue. So in other words, this would just be a continuing, perpetuating cycle that wouldn't stop. Another population that was affected by these laws were the Poe. Oscar McAuley, he advocated for sterilization prior to 1907, and this was based off of his first-hand experiences. He's a reverend from Indiana who observed the Ishmael family. And in this family, he saw that they're a Poe family. They married other Poe families, and they had a lot of criminals along with murderers and thieves in this family. And it was over the course of several generations. So it wasn't just within 10 years, it was generations of this behavior, of this family acting in ways that were detrimental to society. And so again, this was another cycle that he among others wanted to stop. So the last population that was affected by these laws were the mentally ill. L. Porter Hoshman, a psychiatrist at the Fort Wayne State School, by the way, he advocated for the utilization of sterilization since some patients, due to their chronic illness, they suffered poor physical and mental health that would impede their ability to take care of future offspring. So if someone was suffering from a chronic illness, they wouldn't be able to take care of their children. So then that would cause their children to not be able to take care of their own future children, and that would result in possibly criminal tendencies, and it would just, again, be a never-ending cycle. Hoshman advocated for sterilizing the mentally ill as he believed that it would allow the mentally ill to have a better life. Additionally, Harry Schaub, earlier, as I mentioned, he was a big proponent of sterilization. He declared that sterilization is a method by which you can render a man sterile without in any way producing a single unfavorable symptom. On the contrary, you improve both his physical and his mental condition. Is there any brutality in this? Is it cruel or inhumane? So this was the viewpoint of eugenic advocates in this day. They believed that sterilization wasn't a punishment, but rather through sterilization, a person's life could be improved. So I'm pretty sure that we all think that sterilization is awful. So why did these people pursue sterilization instead of another method? Why not social work? Well, it was believed that social work would only continue that cycle of poverty, of criminal tendencies. As Rufus Bernard von Kleinsman once said, "We who are strong have borne the burdens of the weak, as we should have done, and the weak have repaid us by furnishing still greater burdens for us to bear." So that belief in the cycle continuing on, no matter intervention, that was why social work was deemed unsuitable for those populations. Additionally, it was believed that it was also believed that those in society deemed unsuitable, the criminals, the mentally ill, etc. Sorry about that. It was believed that they would still reproduce and that cycle would still continue. So why not education or integration? Well, eugenicists deemed educating the mentally defective to be detrimental. The man on the previous slide, he said that he was a superintendent at the Indiana Reformatory, and he explained that in public schools, the academic advancement of normal children were dependent on what the defective pupils of the public schools were allowed to accomplish. In other words, this dependency caused normal children to suffer as they could not develop to their fullest extent. Integration into society would cause catastrophic results, eugenicists believed, because according to this the ideology of the day, heredity played a major role in the criminal tendencies and the mental defects. So if you had a mentally defective person reproduce with a normal person, then their children would be mentally defective, is believed. And because of that, society wouldn't be able to reproduce. So as slightly obvious. There's criticisms to this. It was argued that it was unconstitutional, it infringed on people's rights. It was punishment, and it was painful for the victims. However, there's been several arguments against it. In this letter, an anonymous citizen wrote a letter to the governor at the time, telling him that sterilization was brutal. It was a mutilation of the inmates at the Indiana state institutions. It was cruel. However, eugenicists were able to refute this by saying, well, actually the procedures involved little time, pain, and danger. You didn't need anesthesia, and you recovered rapidly from it. Regarding the constitutionality of it, a judge actually stated that it was constitutional as it is not for the purpose of inflicting additional punishment, but purely a medical measure as the operation is performed for the purpose of producing mental and physical improvement. And then in addition to this, consent was often asked of the patients. This was how the eugenic advocates believed that the law was actually constitutional. So in 1921, the 1907 sterilization law was finally ruled unconstitutional and repealed. However, there's been multiple laws before that for sterilization, such as the law in 1917. The main sterilization law in Indiana, the 1927 one, wasn't repealed until 1974. And even then, even with the passage of the previous laws, such as the 1917 law, that was more so focused on patients' rights. But yes, so the last sterilization law was revoked in 1974 due to the emergence of new viewpoints regarding people's rights. So why was eugenics pursued in Indiana? Well, medical doctors, school superintendents, clergy members, they believed that through eugenics, through these sterilization procedures, could a person's life be bettered. They wouldn't have to be worried about their children. Criminal tendencies wouldn't exist. And they just believed that this was the only way to stop that constant cycle. So in closing, as Harry Sharp once stated, you improved both the patient's physical and his mental condition. Is there any brutality in sterilization? Is it cruel or inhumane? And I believe that quote reflects accurately the sentiment of the time that sterilization was actually helping criminals, the mentally ill, those in poverty. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Brianne. It was a sobering paper. Now we have Hannah Smith. I guess sobering. Yeah, they used to sterilize drunks. So there it is. Don't drink. You get sterilized. Next is going to be Hannah Smith and her paper entitled The American Dream, All for One or One for All.
The definition of the American dream is entirely dependent on who is defining it. Different people in different groups, like the two political parties, have their own specific idea of what the American dream looks like. The two political parties have always had their differences in how to get things done, but in the 1950s and 1960s, with the rise of the new left and the new right, they had differences in opinion on what needed to be done. There was a fundamental difference in philosophy going on between the Democratic and Republican parties. The Students for a Democratic Society's Port Huron Statement and Allen Ginsberg's How are two examples of a leftist view of the American dream, while Barry Goldwater's Extremism in the Defense of Liberty and the Young American for Freedom's Sharon Statement are examples of a rightist view of the American dream. The two sides, the left and the right, have differences in their opinions as to what the American dream is composed of. The left believing that it involves participatory democracy, the right believing it involves individualism and freedom, as shown in the following four sources. For Barry Goldwater and the Republican Party, private property was the cornerstone of the American dream, with the government's role being to help people obtain property. In his acceptance speech for the nomination by the Republican Party for the presidency in 1964, Goldwater spoke of extremism in the defense of liberty. In the speech, Goldwater suggests that when he says that the responsibility of the government is not to stagnate in the swampland of collectivism, that the United States should fight against communism. Communism can be fought, according to Goldwater, by taking extreme measures. When he said that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, and moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue, he stated the Republican agenda to protect liberty at all costs, and rejected the more liberal defense of justice. He says that the framework of the government should guarantee the orderly but dynamic fulfillment of the whole man as an individual. He then stated that the government should provide the people with the right to private property. Goldwater's idea of the American dream was the freedom to get rich. Goldwater said that the government should perform only those needed and constitutionally sanctioned tasks, which included regulating the economy, encouraging a free market economy, and imposing law and order. In this way, Goldwater's idea of the American dream is capitalistic, unregulated by government, and individual achievement over the collective welfare. Following in Goldwater's footsteps was a conservative student group, the Young Americans for Freedom, and their vision of the American dream. For the Young Americans for Freedom, the American dream was obtaining economic freedom, which included fighting communism to defend a free market economy. The Young Americans for Freedom wrote the Sharon Statement in 1960 to outline what they thought was the proper role of the government. Like Goldwater, who saw freedom made orderly by the constitutional government, the Young Americans for Freedom believed that the Constitution was the best arrangement yet to achieve this freedom. They believed that the American dream grew from the United States Constitution, not from arbitrary force or personal whim. The Young Americans for Freedom also believed that the American dream meant having a market economy, as they believed it the most productive supplier of human needs. The American dream is not a communist dream, the Young Americans for Freedom agreed, and the United States should be willing to go to war to defend itself against all enemies that jeopardize the freedom and the rights of the people. The Young Americans for Freedom played a large role in getting Barry Goldwater nominated for the presidential candidacy, and their visions of the American dream are so similar that it's almost as if they wrote his acceptance speech for him. For Allen Ginsberg, a beatnik, poet, and social leftist, the American dream meant being enlightened, having a sound mind filled with ideas and imagination, rather than materialistic commodities. Howl, a poem written by Ginsberg in 1955, is a poem about American life, a primary character of which is Moloch, a euphemism for militaristic, materialistic American society. In Howl, Ginsberg refers to Moloch as being made of cement and aluminum and ash cans, all of which are allusions to the cold, hard, industrial inhumanity of American society. Ginsberg then goes on to say in the 5th stanza that Moloch's breast is a cannibal dynamo. This suggests that American society is an inhumane, heartless machine that feeds off the energy of other machines. Ginsberg sought to speak on the behalf of the best minds of his generation when he rooted that the American dream is people's humane treatment of one another. The 4th stanza of the poem speaks of Moloch's government as stunned. Here, Ginsberg makes the implication that the United States government, during the 1950s, was deaf to the concerns of the people and was only semi-conscious as to what is going on in the lives of the people. This is in conjunction with the 6th stanza when he describes that Moloch's eyes are 1,000 blind windows, meaning that the government has all the power to notice the people and their concerns, but turns away from them or cannot really see them for what they are. Ginsberg went on to say that the soul of American society is electricity and banks, which is a broadside at corporations. He believed that they should not be the core of American society. Ginsberg ended his poem with a final stanza in which he lists all the things that are missing from American society, including visions and ecstasies. For Ginsberg and others on the social left, in the immediate post-war period, the ascendancy of America as the most powerful nation on earth brought with it inhumanity and militant disregard for human existence. Thus, the American dream, which in Ginsberg's mind was centered on community and enlightenment, was lost to crass materialism. A different student group, the Students for a Democratic Society, did not share the Young American for Freedom's vision of the American dream. In fact, their position was diametrically opposed, as evident in the leftist group's manifesto written in 1962, the Port Huron Statement. In it, they articulate an American dream centered on participatory democracy, equality, and fair government. The statement shares criticisms of capitalism with Allen Ginsberg, challenging it as inhumane. The goal of the people in a society should be human independence, or freedom of thought. The statement goes on to say that for many Americans, all crusades, social campaigns for change, are suspect, suggesting that Americans tend to be uncomfortable with change. However, the Students for a Democratic Society said that a change needed to take place in American society if they are to achieve the American dream. Participatory democracy, according to the Students for a Democratic Society, is then one piece of the American dream. For the Students for a Democratic Society, another part of the American dream is equality, particularly racial equality, which is evident when they say that the victimizing fact of human degradation is shown through the Southern struggle against racial bigotry. The search for equality also includes economic equality, according to the Students for a Democratic Society, as 2/3 of mankind suffers undernourishment, while the United States upper class revel among superfluous abundance. America's goal of equality and democracy, according to the Students for a Democratic Society, demand a government that is informed and clear, instead of tradition-bound and manipulated by the military-industrial complex, which depersonalized this. Finally, the Students for a Democratic Society channel Allen Ginsberg when they argue that possession, privilege, and circumstance should be replaced with love, reflectiveness, and creativity. According to Extremism in the Defense of Liberty, the Sharon Statement, Howell, and the Port Huron Statement, the New Right and the New Left had conflicting views of what the American dream should look like. Goldwater and the Young Americans for Freedom believed that it should be about individualism and possessions, while Ginsberg and the Students for a Democratic Society believed that it should include community and feeling. Thus, even today, these documents are as relevant as they were 50 years ago, as they outline the yin and the yang of the American dream, individual rights and collective rights. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Hannah. The final speaker for today's panel is going to be Holly Holland, and her paper also is addressing an aspect of the American dream. It's entitled American Dream, Inclusion by Ethnicity and Family. Holly.
Thank you. Before I begin, I would like to thank everyone for coming to the 9th Annual Undergraduate History Conference today, and IPFW's Department of History for hosting this event. As Professor Schuster said, my paper is The American Dream, Inclusion Through Ethnicity and Family. The American dream, like many abstract ideas that lack real definitions, is particularly difficult to pin down, even though it may invoke concrete goals and objects for many. Due to its ever-changing nature, defining the American dream is nearly impossible and exhaustive. Understanding what the American dream constitutes, however, is achievable and applicable, especially in today's political and cultural climate that we live. For the purpose of this presentation, the aspects of the American dream are constrained to the viewpoints and pertaining to immigrants and members of minority groups. For them, the American dream is acceptance of one's ethnicity and family. Since America has often been considered to be the melting pot of the world's cultures, one would think that the celebration of one's ethnicity would be assured. However, I think as we all know, that's not always the case. Puat Charuk Kam Nok Kunuk, and please forgive me if I butchered that, his ancestors and or his spirit, essays, Triple Identity, My Experience as an Immigrant in America, highlights the alienation felt from being omitted from the American dream based on ethnic aspects. As an immigrant in America, Puat grapples with his own identity and its conflict with American culture. Sorry. Puat interestingly summarizes that he has not experienced prejudice directly, but the existence of racism has affected me just the same. By the awareness of this, the author himself became hypersensitive by not only his appearance, but also his speech, causing him to be self-conscious about his accent-tinged English. As he writes, he comes to the conclusion that his grandparents and father achieved inclusion by not caring what other people thought. And by doing the same, he could combine the good qualities of each of his identities into one and himself. It's Puat's ultimate identity crisis and revelation that leads to the idea that inclusion is equal to the acceptance of his ethnic identities. For Charukam Nuknuk, the American dream is being accepted for not only his new American status, but also his Taiwanese and Chinese heritage. Much like Puat, his journey of self-identity, the League of United Latin American Citizens, compounds upon this idea of inclusion by ethnicity by highlighting the deserving yet exclusion of Latin Americans in their search for the American dream. In the LULAC editorial, World War II and Mexican Americans, the LULAC begs the question of the lengths one has to go in order to achieve the American dream. The LULAC artfully likens their borrowing from the American dream and society to that of a disease which plagues America and can only be inoculated by accepting of one's ethnicity, but also the recognition of Latin American similarities to that of white America. The LULAC utilizes the likening of Mexican Americans to that of white American society, highlights their desire to be included and treated as equal, as they have proved themselves true and loyal Americans and thus deserve the opportunity to practice and enjoy the freedom in which they fought for. Their proof being their service with the American military during the Second World War. For the LULAC and Latin Americans, they are deserving yet excluded from the American dream to enjoy freedoms that they fought for. Unlike the LULAC, in it strives to liken Latin Americans to that of white America and appeals to military service, Martin Luther King Jr. appeals to African American citizenship in his reprinted and arranged speech titled Meeting at Holt Street Church. King Jr. does this by making a clear distinction between Rosa Parks' ethnicity and citizenship of Montgomery, stating that she was not one of the finest Negro citizens, but one of the finest citizens of Montgomery. This intentional distinction emphasizes King Jr. and the civil rights movement's desire to be seen not by the color of their skin, but as their citizenship. For African Americans and the civil rights movements, they are excluded from the American dream as a whole, based merely upon their skin color, even though they have citizenship. He ends his speech announcing that not only is this a thing of education, but it is also a process of legislation, meaning the American dream can only be achieved by African Americans if they are accepted for their ethnicity through their fellow citizens' eyes, but as well as the eyes of the law. While Martin Luther King Jr. advocates for a nonviolent inclusion, former President Lyndon B. Johnson argues that not only is their ethnicity a factor for exclusion, but also their crumbling family structure within the African American community. Lyndon emphasizes the way in which the African American equality is different than that of white America by stating statistics to illustrate them as another nation. For Johnson, the American dream is more concerned with the acceptance and shared responsibility to maintain a stable family structure. Johnson maintained this throughout his speech, that the family unit is at the very core of American society. By fixing it, the cycle of despair and depravity for the African community will come to an end. For Puat, the American dream was the inclusion of different ethnicities and the acceptance of such identities. While both the LULAC and African Americans are undoubtedly deserving of achieving this American dream, both are omitted based upon the shallow pretense of mannerisms, accents, color, and family structure, all of which are derived from their ethnicity. For many immigrants and minority groups in America, the American dream must be one of inclusion. For them, the American dream holds more than material, financial, or religious gains. It is one of self-acceptance and security in one's identity. In today's political and cultural climate here in America, we can see that these exclusionist ideas that held so fervently in the past have not been eroded away. This can be easily witnessed with the xenophobic and exclusionist speech directed at those who are born from Muslim countries. This apparent connection shows that the transcendence idea of the American dream and how it may or may not always be attainable and could, after all, be a mere dream. Before I end my presentation, I would like to leave you with some questions, and please keep in mind, I do not have the answer to these questions. However, I think it is paramount that we continue to ask ourselves these questions so that as a society, we could probably come up with a really good answer. Like Puat, should we ban the American dream merely based upon a difference in ethnicity? Are those who serve alongside and with our military deserving enough for the American dream? Like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks, should we disallow the American dream from those who are a different skin color? Shall we as a country continue to keep broken families the status quo? Shall we make the American dream a reality? Thank you.
All right, folks, that's 3 papers that tackle in one way or another the idea of American identity. Any questions out there or comments? Yeah.
I got one specifically directed for eugenics. I'm so happy that I saw that. So during that progressive era, just to provide more context, like during that progressive era time, we saw an intellectual push for eugenics, not only in America, starting at Harvard, but across the pond as well. And if you actually look, Associate Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes and Buck v. Bell argue that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, that we kind of like erect in the academy. And I'm curious, we keep seeing the trends like associated with what the former generations are teaching the latter generations, right? And I'm kind of curious as to, in Indiana, what sort of education did those 3 men receive, and with the understanding that it was happening like throughout our republic and then other parts in the world as well, was the Midwest like were those asylums created? Was it because of the vast land and like the population that we could transport there and things of that sort?
I believe that, like, I didn't go so much into depth in my research on the asylums because I was focused on the motivations, but why were these various groups of people pursuing eugenics? But I think to answer your question, in the Midwest, those asylums were created because at the time it was seen as like shameful to have someone in your family who wasn't considered normal. And so to hide that, they would send their family members off to these asylums or to these schools for education. And so this wasn't just seen in the Midwest, if I'm correct. It was seen across the country.
California had a very aggressive eugenics.
Margaret Sanger, I mean, the people who were supportive of eugenics, Margaret Sanger was one of the biggest. She started Planned Parenthood. And so Planned Parenthood, whether you love it or not, today had its roots in some kind of evil.
Well, you know, I wouldn't go that far because I'm an advocate of Planned Parenthood. I wouldn't say that they're evil, but you're right. There's definitely something coming out of the progressive period where you had experts and they thought they knew better than other people, and I think that's the bottom line.
To go off of that, that's why the definition of what is eugenics is so debated about, because technically, if we go off the definition I use, that is trying to improve the human population, both control today, that people have access to contraceptives. Those are technically eugenic measures. And to bring it back to California, California's like California's sterilization laws, along with North Carolina's, for example, they came from Indiana's, like so.
All right. Other questions? Yes.
I have a question for Fiona, actually. When I was listening to your paper, it made me think of some things from the Greek and Roman periods, and I'm wondering if the authors you looked at, if they were influenced by or if they talked about using classical models at all.
What I looked at, no, but I would assume yes, based off of my general understanding of Enlightenment and their almost obsession with the Greeks and Romans. So it wouldn't be too surprising if that was influenced, especially since it was really valued that you could read Latin and you could read Greek. Abigail Adams could read both, and so she was like the ideal, so it would make sense that they would be influenced by those. Mm-hmm.
Other questions? Yes, talk about.
I'm going to try to ask a big, broad question for all of you guys to answer. But one sort of theme kind of tying all of this together is sort of different views of morality, right? So the theme was identity, but deciding which identity is better or worse, which should persevere, comes down to different people's morals. And one thing I sort of heard from different papers in different ways is the strength of arguments of science versus the church. So, you know, Fiona's paper, you've got, you know, there's definitely a lot of religious aspects, but also the kind of talking about the Enlightenment, that's rationality, that's science. I mean, Bray, you're talking about, you know, science and heredity, and Lombroso is the root of what decides what's moral or not. Hannah, I didn't find that as much as yours, although I was trying to think of the metaphor of the machine that Ginsburg used, and in some ways machines couldn't be more scientific, right? And Holly, of course, you talk about the diseased social body. So there was a lot of that, those questions of what's driving people to decide what's best for the social body. So I guess if I'm gonna ask you to reflect on anything, I would ask you to say, what was sort of the driving ideology behind your various actors and their decisions about what makes one group more moral than others? Do you think that science was more dominant? Do you think that religion was more dominant? Was industry dominant? Was politics? How did decisions about what was moral kind of come about?
Well, I'll go first then. So at least for the Cult of Domesticity, industrialization was really big during that time. That's the transition into American industrialization. And though I focus primarily on Western, personally, a lot of the temperance movements and the advocacy for helping poor, when I did my research, a lot of it was to help them improve their morality. So in a sense, the religious aspect was stronger than the industrial movement, and I guess technically science by that point, because they were so focused on, even though they're doing these hard and dirty jobs, they still need to stay and remain moral and stay true to the family, because if they start drinking, then it's an automatic down spiral to destitution, failure for the country.
To answer your question, from what I found in my research, it was more so science with undertones of religion. So for the science aspect, it was believed that being a criminal was due to your genetics, and so they were trying to make sure that society didn't become filled with criminals, so that's why they wanted to prevent those people from reproducing. In terms of like those religious undertones, like many people believe that through making sure that some people didn't reproduce, then they'd be living a better life. For example, in this case of the people suffering from a chronic illness, how this was the idea. I can't talk. This was the ideology of the time, where it's like, how do you expect these people to be able to live a happy life if they have to take care of someone else when they can't take care of their own self? So it was just trying to help improve their life.
Yeah, I mean, it was less like science and church, like you said, but I think for the right, it was more about like tangible, concrete things, you know, like property and things like that. And for the left, it was more like abstract ideas and feeling and intellectualism.
Yeah, I would agree with Hannah here that mine heavily focused on the more abstract idea of the American dream and less about financial goals, owning a house, you know, the kind of, I wouldn't say typical American dream, but usually what we associate with when we think of the American dream. A lot of my viewpoints in this presentation is, I think, heavily colored by politics during the time, especially Martin Luther King. But he also was colored, that's the wrong word. Well, tinged with like a religious undertone, especially earlier in his speech, he did mention how if the civil rights movement was wrong, then Jesus was wrong. So he definitely alluded to Christianity as a crutch and a driving force behind his movement. So I'd say both political and religious aspects definitely helped propel the argument of the American dream being about inclusion.
Other questions? Let's start out over here. We'll go Sam and we'll go Seth.
This is kind of directed toward Fiona, but the rest can weigh in. It's been written many times that at the time of the American Revolution, most men assumed, there's a dangerous word, assumed that their wives' interests were the very same as the men. Mm-hmm. Weigh in, how did that change? Because my wife is
So are you saying how it changed from then to now?
Yes, just pretty much. What events, what things helped to change that?
A lot of things, not so much in my research. There's a tinge of that in Republican motherhood where they're supposed to think of intellectual equals and the beginnings of an intellectual equal. That doesn't mean they'd have to disagree. It was still encouraged that they would agree. This is a broad, long shot. I would start saying probably second wave feminism is probably your best bet of when that started to change. But I'm not an expert on that, so I cannot confirm that officially. But that's what I would guess most officially.
Anyone else?
It's okay if you don't.
Yeah, I would just say, like, just throughout, like, history, like, all the different women and feminism movements just kind of got us to that place.
Abolitionism as well. Mm-hmm. It allowed women to be able to see, wow, I'm not owned by someone like a slave is, and therefore, you know.
And there was a lot of mockery of like the suffragist husbands, like they would be stuck at home mashing the potatoes and cooking and holding the baby. Yeah, exactly. And so there's a lot of political cartoons relating to that.
I think it was also a very natural progression to go from, oh, I'm not owned by my husband anymore, to automatically thinking, well, I am my own person, therefore my own thoughts and my ideas, my theories or whatever are my own and they are validated.
Just on the opposite side of that, I wonder if Holly talked about how certain things seem to have persisted, but you think about eugenics or Republican motherhood, and Sam mentioned that Republican motherhood, how did things, why is it different today? Do we still see elements of eugenics and Republican motherhood? Do you think those things?
You can answer first. You did address eugenics first.
Well, I do believe that there's still some aspects to it. Again, like we can still see some of the eugenics movement today. And then, like my research, like my paper wasn't so much focused on on the bulk of eugenics after 1920s. So when Republican motherhood, I believe, when that first started becoming more so, that was when was that?
19 for the contraceptive bill?
Yeah.
1960s.
Like, yes, that was like that was more so outside the realm that I did it in, but you can still see how like they made an influence and like how they're able to begin making that choice. Like I didn't focus it in my research paper, but there were like these baby contests where women were encouraged to show their babies and just demonstrate that they're choosing to have to help the human population, if that slightly answers.
And for Republican motherhood, a lot of like religiously conservative families that still expect, like, there's still some sort of ideas where a point of a woman's religion is, or not of her religion, excuse me, of her education is so that when she gets married, she can stay home and teach her children more effectively. That is still a current prevailing idea. It hasn't disappeared. And neither has the idea that, you know, the woman is supposed to stay home and cook. That's still a very prevailing idea. The fact that we still have problems in the workplace, that there's issues and all sorts of things that's not related to my paper at all, means that there are still nuances of these two movements still current today.
Seth, I haven't forgotten about you.
Thank you. Holly, you mentioned LBJ in your paper.
Yeah.
You know, he done the most for civil rights and gave them equal opportunity, like voting, income-wise, I believe, and all that. Do you think it's interesting that he had done the most for civil rights more than any other president and he was a racist?
No, that is kind of a difficult question. I do find that to be interesting, yes, but I would also, I mean, he did take an oath of office, and even if you do have some unsavory, I suppose, opinions and ideas about minority groups and those of color, that I feel like Lyndon B. Johnson, even though he had those opinions, that his faith in office and his duty to be the great president, that he would set those aside in order to benefit the country as a whole.
I agree, thank you.
Others, yes and then yes.
This is going mostly to Brian. Do you see adoption law and laws regarding who can and in what circumstances adopt as sort of an extension of eugenics or a legacy of eugenics after it became impossible for like the government to make medical decisions for people after Supreme Court cases?
I do see adoption laws as an extension of eugenics, because even though it's not restricting certain people from having children, it is restricting certain people on who can raise these children. So that seems to be implying that certain groups of people today aren't worthy enough, or aren't well suited enough to be giving their values or their tendencies to potential adopted children.
Yeah, Tom.
I wondered if you found any reinforcing cleavages in any of your issues where the divisions that you're talking about overlap with, say, rural versus urban divides or class divides or something like that, or were they pretty cross-cutting cleavages that, you know, broadly affected people and didn't overlap with a lot of things?
Who was that to?
In general.
All of us.
Oh, okay.
Anyone want to jump?
I'll go first. So one of the paragraphs that I had to cut due to time talked about how the part of the transition from Republican motherhood to the Cult of Domesticity was the Jacksonian election and the age of the common man, in which men got the right to vote. It's interesting because even though all white men became more equal, it actually, in a weird sense, and I couldn't remember exactly how I read it correctly, it actually almost lowered the standards of expectation for women, because before they were supposed to be the equals, but then they kind of got subverted back to more traditional roles, because it's kind of like a pure sense of the idealism. So it's a pure sense of democracy in the sense that it's all the people, and pure sense of gender roles in that women belong in the private sphere and men belong out in the public sphere.
In the case of eugenics, it was definitely a class issue. It was one of the affected populations were those living in poverty for the negative eugenics laws that Indiana pursued. Additionally, Additionally, it was an issue across just society, because just intelligence, or what they deemed to be intelligent behavior. So certain groups were affected by eugenics just because of that. And then additionally, it was I didn't mention this at all, but typically it was those living in the rural areas that were affected by eugenics, because they tended to be more so in poverty than those in urban areas.
Yeah, also that's an interesting question that I didn't really look into, but I mean, Ginsburg was a poet, so, and then Goldwater was a politician, obviously, so maybe there was some sort of class thing going on there. That's interesting.
Again, great question. I think my aspect of the American dream really connects to almost all, like class, race, ethnicity. With Puat, he was an immigrant coming here from China, though his grandfather and father were a mixture of Taiwanese and Chinese. And in his essay, he talks about how his grandfather and father felt very comfortable, and they did not experience the type of prejudice over in China and Taiwanese because they're rather ethnically similar than that of America. And when he came here, he was really grappling with this idea of how can I be an American citizen and yet still feel so ostracized against the general American public, and grappling with this idea that I am both American, Taiwanese, and Chinese. And so I think that definitely pertains to the racial aspect of the American dream. Martin Luther King, wonderful man. Obviously, he is part of a minority group, also a preacher and a wonderful civil rights activist. He really, I think, tried to transcend this idea of the civil rights movement pertaining only to the African American community and trying to, and successfully outreaching that to that of white Americans and other social classes. And Lyndon B. Johnson, obviously president, former president, different class structure, but his worry and awareness of the struggles of those who are lower than him, I think, illustrates how the American dream doesn't really have any boundaries and that it can go either which way depending on who is defining it, like Hannah said in her paper.
Any other questions? Okay, one, two, yeah.
I have one more. I'm going to be polemical, or I guess ask you guys to be polemical. One of my favorite professors in grad school was very optimistic, and she believes that the arc of history is towards greater liberties and greater freedoms, and we're only improving in our equality and our openness. However, she said that before the age of Donald Trump. And it seems to me that we are now living in a time of identity politics. I mean, you guys have covered things from the early 19th century up through the mid-20th century. So what I want to ask you guys is where you think we are going as society, and covering each of your issues. I mean, Fiona, you know, we've just seen the Women's March on the world, right? Are things better? Are they going in the right direction for women? Brianne, talking about the poor. I mean, the poor, I'm not going to get too much into politics, but a lot of things that have been passed seem to be detrimental to the poor. I mean, Hannah, left and right seem like they're more at odds now than ever. And Holly, as you mentioned in your paper, we're still looking at bans and exclusions for different ethnicities. So what do you guys think? What has history taught you about our present moment? What have your papers taught you about where we are and where we're going? And are you optimistic or pessimistic?
I guess I hate to be a pessimist, but I do believe in it.
Too much history.
It'll just kill you. I do believe in the old saying, you know, history is doomed to repeat itself unless we learn from it and we continue to keep it in the back of our mind and the forefront. And, you know, we see all the time how one part of humanity seems to have reached a success or a betterment, while that's in the forefront of the public sphere, something else is falling behind. And I think it's kind of a push-pull with humanity and history, you know. And we have such a weird connection with history now, considering that we're in the digital age versus books and CDs and all that. But yeah, I think especially with Trump, I don't know. I'm not going to apologize for being political because I'm an American. But, you know, this Trump administration is definitely, I think, going to bring about a certain awareness of things that have happened in the past and the reoccurrence that it may or may not happen again. So I'll leave it at that.
I think had you asked me that question in like October, I would have been optimistic about it. But I think you're right. With Trump, I honestly don't know which way it's going to go. I can see it. If Trump does well for himself, I can see it going downhill a lot. But yeah, I guess only time will tell.
I hate to be pessimistic, but but it seems to be the only case, because the original issue with tying it back to my presentation, the biggest issue with eugenics was how it didn't allow people to have that choice. It felt like it was a first decision upon them, and with the way politics currently are these days, it's actually the reverse flip of, yes, like there's all these options, but it feels as though they're being taken away, so you don't have that choice anymore.
Well, I'm not going to give a definite answer because I don't actually know the definite answer, and that's just generally true. The thing about history, and especially for women's movements and women's rights, is that generally they ebb and flow, and that's just how most things go. And there's some interesting research into how like dress and makeup and all that affects. You can see that in the cultures based off of that. So I don't really know. It could go worse. It could. I don't know, or it could just go better. And if it does go worse or go better, then there's always going to be a backlash in 10 or 20 years. So I don't know.
There is always ebb and flow, and this conference also has ebb and flow, and I guess we are ebbing now to the end of the panel. So thank you very much.